These were their last words. Their names define a movement. Their deaths, a call for justice, a demand for change.
Let us be dissatisfied until that day when nobody will shout white power, when nobody will shout black power, but everybody will talk about God's power and human power.
Background information. What is Black Lives Matter? To combat racism and anti-Black violence, an international campaign was founded in the United States in 2013. Because Black individuals were murdered by police significantly more frequently than white people, the movement was given the title Black Lives Matter. The idea of BLM gained traction after on February 26, 2012, a neighborhood watch volunteer named George Zimmerman spotted Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old African-American boy, returning from a convenience store. Zimmerman made contact with the Sanford Police Department's non-emergency unit. He said that a man was strolling around who appeared unsettling and suspicious. Additionally, he said that Martin was doing drugs and was acting off, although that was not true at all. The dispatcher told him not to be concerned and assured him he is not a threat and most likely just walking through the neighborhood. Zimmerman made the decision to follow Martin in his car rather than listening to the dispatcher. He exited his car where a violent altercation started. Martin was shot by Zimmerman at a close range, which ultimately resulted in Martin's death. When police arrived, Zimmerman claimed that he had acted in self-defense, but Martin was not carrying a weapon and couldn't have hurt him, especially since this was an altercation between a grown man carrying a weapon and a 17-year-old boy who was unarmed. Due to the lack of concrete proof of the altercation, they were unable to hold Zimmerman accountable. He was subsequently released. Zimmerman was charged with manslaughter after being judged responsible in the weeks that followed the incident. Today, Zimmerman is still walking freely. Since everything that happened could have been avoided, many people view this as unfairness. As soon as Zimmerman spotted a black child wandering around, he instinctively anticipated the worst and racially profiled him. This resulted in an innocent teenager's death. Unfortunately, this happens pretty frequently, many of which go unnoticed and ignored. This case enabled for the advocacy of others who have experienced injustices and served as the catalyst for the entire BLM movement. Who was involved? Before the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, there were several African American civil rights protesters such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Angela Davis, and more, who contributed to the advocating for Black individuals and their civil liberties. They all participated in demonstrations against the injustices African Americans were experiencing at the time and helped launch numerous more civil rights movements for other racial groups. Rosa Parks, an African American lady, started the civil rights movement by refusing to give up her seat and move to the rear for a white man. She was detained and fined as a result of her refusal. Many people found this to be an eye-opening experience, and it marked the start of a new phase in the civil rights struggle that produced the Freedom Riders, the Little Rock Nine, and the boycott of the Montgomery buses. Then, more civil rights movement advocates started to contribute. As I said earlier, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and multiple other civil rights figures were participating, and a revolution was underway. These incidents served as sort of the cornerstones of the Black Lives Matter campaign. Even after the civil rights demonstrations, the police continued to treat Black people unfairly. In light of that, the hashtag Black Lives Matter is a movement that was founded in 2013 by activists Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi to advocate for the rights of Black people.
When a Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd 2 years ago, the video of his killing immediately ricocheted around the web. The social media movement that followed was massive. Millions of people took to the streets and the internet to express a desire for racial justice in the United States, in a movement that has become encaptured by the hashtag Black Lives Matter. During these protests, law enforcement repeatedly used physical force, chemical irritants such as tear gas, pepper spray, kinetic impact projectiles, and arresting protesters as a first resort tactic against peaceful protesters rather than as a response to any sort of actual threat or violence. The vast majority of protests went peaceful. Still, many people continue to believe that Black Lives Matter protests are largely violent. Contrary to popular belief, 93% of protests went peaceful. This disparity stems from political orientation and biased media framing, such as the disproportionate coverage of violent demonstrations. During the civil unrest of 2020, then-President Donald Trump called on governors to deploy the National Guard to quote-unquote dominate protesters. And the Justice Department launched Operation Legend, a collaboration of federal and deputized local law enforcement. At the conclusion of Operation Legend in December 2020, the Justice Department reported that out of 6,000 people arrested, about 1,500 have been charged with federal offenses. The available data demonstrates that the majority of protest-related prosecutions, 52%, were brought against defendants who identified as being Black. The data indicates that Black protesters were disproportionately subjected to federal protest-related charges. Historically, policing has been used as a major tool to deter Black people from engaging in their right to protest and weaken efforts to draw attention to issues that might be impacting Black Americans.
What is the goal of the citizens? So the overall goal of the Black Lives Matter movement is to gain racial justice for those who identify as Black. They are fighting racially motivated police brutality through the use of peaceful protesting. BLM activists are attempting to draw attention to the violence through uses of social media and television and more. The hope is that their fights result in a world with equal human rights and no racial oppression or supremacy. So what are the results of this event, both short and long term? So as the Black Lives Matter movement has not been around for too long, there are no long-term effects prevalent at this moment. But as for short-term effects, as the movement has progressed, it has been posted over social media, television, and more, drawing attention to the matter. This has resulted in people taking action and protesting for their voices to be heard.
Links to liberalism. BLM connects to liberalism as it embraces the same ideals as modern liberalism, because it upholds fundamental libertarian principles including social justice, equality, and civil liberties. These concepts are heavily promoted throughout the protests, therefore they play an essential role in the BLM movement.
Black Lives Matter by Adna, Eliza, and Najma.